Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Tim. Well, good afternoon. It's good to be here. This feels very authentic, doesn't it? First century cushions on the floor. It's great. You should keep it like this. So as Tim said, I'm a member at Emmanuel Bishopston, and it's lovely to come and visit you and share this passage with you. If you're new, or this is maybe the first or second time you've come, as a family of churches in the autumn, we work through a chunk of Luke's gospel, and we're towards the end of the gospel now. And so just by way of a quick recap of where we've been in the last few weeks. Now, last year, chapter 9 to 19, Jesus was traveling, and basically traveled for 10 chapters and arrived in Jerusalem in our time a few weeks ago, but just last chapter, basically. And he's been on this collision course with the Pharisees, with the religious establishment of the time. And he arrives in Jerusalem, and it's during the festival of Passover. So there are tons and tons of people in the city. Thousands of travelers from all over the country would have been flowing into the city for the festival of Passover. And Jesus arrives, and he arrives with lots of his followers. We don't know how many, but enough to cause quite a big stir. And they proclaim him as king, the king who brings peace. And the first thing that Jesus does on arriving in Jerusalem is he goes straight to the temple. And he says some pretty incendiary stuff. So if you were here a couple of weeks ago, we heard that Jesus, he called the temple, he said the religious establishment had turned the temple into their den. He called them robbers. So the temple had become this den of robbers, is what he said. And so he was then challenged by the chief priests. So, the priests were the people that were in charge of, the Jewish religion at the time, and the chief priests were the people in charge of the temple. And they challenged him and said, "What gives you the authority to come here and call us robbers?" And Jesus tells the parable that we've just read in response. And the parable is just explosive, isn't it? The parable basically says that the chief priests, the religious establishment, both historically and presently, opposes God, opposes his prophets, and opposes his son. And the people can't believe it when they hear this. I don't know if you noticed that in looking down at verse 16, when the people heard this, so they hear the parable, they hear what Jesus has said about the religious establishment, and they say, "May this never be," or "God forbid" is another translation, or "surely not. Surely you don't mean that the teachers of the law and the chief priests oppose God and his prophets. Surely you don't mean that they've turned this place into a den of robbers." But that is what Jesus taught. And you've got to imagine the scene right there in the temple, because presumably Jesus' followers were with him. There's a crowd of people hanging on his every word, and he's just said this explosive thing, challenging the chief priests. And presumably there's this moment as he finishes the parable where the eyes of the crowd turn from Jesus, who's been preaching, attentively listening to him, to the chief priests. And that's where we pick up in verse 19. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. No kidding, they're afraid of the people. Imagine that. Jesus, he's brought with him his whole crowd of followers, people who are devoted to him, who've seen him work miracles, who think he's the king. He's challenged the chief priests, and now the chief priests are in a position where they're under threat. Previously in the Gospel of Luke, we've seen that they opposed Jesus, but that was principally on the basis that they thought he was a blasphemer. They thought that he was breaking the law. But now he's a threat to them because the crowd has turned against them, or the crowd could turn against them, if he's continuing to go out and preach this parable, this message, to these thousands of people that have flooded into the city. So that's the context of the story so far. So the Pharisees, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, they're backed into a corner and they need to make their move. So verse 20, keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be honest. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said, that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. The chief priests, they set a trap. That's their plan. They need to get rid of Jesus, ideally kill him, but if not, they need to at least remove his followers from him. They need to do something that will mean that the crowd dissipates and disappears and the whole fuss stops. But the thing is, they can't now challenge him directly, can they? Because they've just done that and they've been called out as robbers. And so they get these actors in. They bring in these spies, verse 20, who pretend to be honest. So they find some people who are willing to fake faith and follow Jesus around and ask him this question that's going to trap him. Verse 21. So the spies questioned him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." Here's the trap. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, if you're not familiar with the context, that might not sound like a trap, but actually the Romans, they'd been in power for quite a while, a few generations by this point. So the Roman Empire conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC, and they gave Israel some freedoms. So the Jews were allowed to operate religiously as they wanted, but they taxed the people extremely heavily. And obviously the Jews hated that. You know, you can imagine if Russia wins the war in Ukraine, imagine in 15 years' time the Ukrainians having to pay tax to Putin. That's something like the situation here. The Jews hated paying taxes to Caesar, and especially one specific tax, which was a tax especially for the emperor. And that was especially galling because Caesar proclaimed himself to be the Son of God. So they weren't only paying taxes to an oppressive regime, they were paying taxes to a pagan, heretical, oppressive regime. They hated it. And I suppose for us now today, it's easy to think of this as an academic question that they pose Jesus. But if you think about the core group of Jesus' disciples, this wouldn't have been academic, would it? You know, in amongst Jesus' group of 12 disciples, that group included Matthew, who was a tax collector. So Matthew, who worked for the Romans, collected taxes, skimmed a bit off the top for himself, and then gave it to the Romans. So the Jews hated tax collectors. So he was one of Jesus' disciples. So there's him. And then if you read the list of the other disciples in chapter 6, they also include a man called Simon. So Jesus' disciples include a tax collector, Matthew, and a man called Simon. Not Simon Peter, the Apostle Peter, another Simon called Simon the Zealot. Now, that's interesting. If you've read that before, you might be like me, where you read that and you think, oh, he must have just been a particularly enthusiastic guy. He was like a white-hot Jesus freak, and people were like, so they nicknamed him the Zealot. And turns out, if you read some commentaries, that's not what that means. Zealot is actually a title, or it's a identifier because he belonged to a particular group called the Zealots. And they were basically a group of Jewish pirate bandits, basically. I don't know how else to describe them. They lived in the hills around the cities, and they were so zealous for the kingdom, so zealous for the Lord, and so desperate to kick Rome out of Israel that they would raid Roman transport caravans and assassinate tax collectors. That's what the zealots did. So within Jesus' disciples, you've got a tax collector and a zealot, an assassinator of tax collectors. So you can imagine they would have had to have some conflict resolution counseling with Jesus to get those two working together. But point being, this is not an academic issue. This is a real core issue to the disciples. And the question underneath it all is the Messiah here to boot Rome out of Israel? Is the Messiah here to take Caesar's throne? That's the question underneath it all, isn't it? How does Jesus' kingdom relate to the kingdom of Rome and of the world? And so within that context, the chief priests, they come up with this question that they hope will divide Jesus' camp. Should we pay taxes to Caesar? And it's a clever question, isn't it? Because one of two things is going to happen. Jesus is either going to say, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, and so align himself with Rome, with the enemy, at which point his followers will just dissipate. That, why would you follow someone who's aligning himself with our enemies? So that's one outcome. Or he'll say, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. And that's even better, because if he says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, all the chief priests have to do is go to Pilate or Herod and say, this Jesus guy is inciting a rebellion, telling us not to pay tax, which incidentally is exactly what they say. They lie later on in the gospel. So for the chief priests, it's a win-win situation. Jesus is stuck. Either he answers yes, he gets his disciples, his followers, leave him because he aligns himself with Rome, or he answers no, and then they can go to the Romans and say, here you go, this guy's inciting a rebellion. He's part of this group of zealots. Deal with him as such. So, Jesus' answer. Verse 23. He saw through their duplicity and said to them, show me a denarius, whose portrait, or better translation, whose image and inscription are on it. Now, eBay is a weird place. It turns out, if you go to eBay and you type in denarius, you can buy one. Here we go. This is a denarius. It actually is. You can't really see it because it's so dark, but have a look. It's a tiny little coin. That one cost £8 plus postage, so bargain. The reason it was so cheap is because it's not the emperor. If you want to buy one with Tiberius, who was the emperor when Jesus was around, they're like £500. But if you buy one like that was 100 years after Jesus, they're cheap. No one wants them. But yeah, basically, point is, it's a tiny little coin. It was worth about a day's wage for a labourer. There was a special tax, this special tax that I mentioned earlier, that went straight to the emperor, and it was one of these little coins, a denarius. And so, where's it gone? Jesus says, bring me a denarius. Very much like this. Bring me a denarius. Oh, look, there's one. And he says, whose image is on it? Whose image is on it? Oh, Caesar's, they replied. And this is the answer that it just absolutely floors the chief priests. This answer, what he's about to say, means that the chief priests can no longer operate out in the open like this. They're so amazed, they're so staggered by his response, that they then start operating in the shadows. They find Judas, because they just can't ask him questions out in the open anymore. They're amazed by him. He said to them, verse 25, he said to them, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The question of if you should pay your taxes or not is a very simple question, Jesus says. It's about ownership. A very simple principle determines whether or not you should give your taxes to Caesar. And it's just if someone owns something and they want it back, you should give it to them. It's not complicated, is it? If someone owns something and they want it back, you should give it to them. Okay, well, fine, Jesus, that's simple enough, but how do you know if they have a legitimate claim to something? How do you know if they own something? And Jesus says, well, their image is on it. Yeah, you can give it back to Caesar. Yeah, give it to him. It's his. But you know that because his image is on it. If he requires it from you to build his roads or pay his armies that are oppressing you, you should give it to him because it's his. He owns it. And actually that principle of submitting to authorities, even authorities that oppose you, that goes right through the Bible. So if you want to read Romans chapter 13, that picks up on these ideas. But it's simple, isn't it? Pay your tax because it's Caesar's and he wants it back. And what that means is that Jesus' kingdom is not opposed to Caesar's kingdom, at least not directly. It's as if he's saying to Simon the Zealot, you don't need to worry about me usurping Caesar. You don't need to worry about Caesar being judged. You just worry about paying your taxes. You just worry about submitting to the authority that God's put above you. But the really remarkable thing, the thing that answer that stuns the chief priests is what he then says. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. Okay, give to God what is God's, fine. How do we know what is God's? Well, his image is on it. Give to God the thing that carries his image, the thing that is made in his image, the thing that bears his image, namely you. All that you are, all that you have, all your resources, all your capacities, everything you are, give that to God. Yeah, you can pay a denarius to Caesar. That's a small thing. But give God what is his, the thing that he claims as his. We are made in God's image. That is the defining statement of what it means to be human. That would have been right in the chief priest's mind. You've got to believe that. That would have been, when Jesus says that, they would have known exactly what he was talking about. We are all made in God's image. And Jesus is saying what that means is that God has stamped his image on you like a coin, and so you belong to him. So it's like Jesus is saying to Simon the Zealot, I'm not here to take Caesar's throne. I'm here to take the throne in every human heart. I want the throne that resides in every heart on the planet. That is Jesus' dominion. That is his kingdom. He wants total surrender. And that's why they're amazed at him. Because in his answer to this trap, he says the one thing that would not only satisfy both sides of the argument, but expand their vision of what the Messiah is here to do. Okay, so what does that mean for us? We don't live under Roman occupation. We live in a democracy. What does that mean for us? Well, the first application I think is quite simple. We should pay our taxes. We should obey the authorities that God has put over us, and we should submit to them. And that will lead to a peaceful society most of the time. And as I say, go to Romans if you want more on this. It's not always. There are some circumstances in which we should disobey the government, but that's the exception to the rule. And I think it's basically only when, if we obey the government, it would mean disobeying God when they conflict very obviously. So like Daniel is an example of someone you can think of who disobeyed the government because it would bring him into his obedience to God, and God blessed him because of that. But that's the general principle is obey the law, listen to those who God has put in authority over us, pay your taxes. But the second application, the more important application, is, I think, still the same, and that is, give to God what is God's. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's, namely us. Jesus is calling us to live a radical life, a life lived in total surrender to him. Jesus is not interested in compartmentalized Christianity, where we say, okay, yeah, Sunday afternoons, we'll give that to Jesus, maybe one night for home group or prayer meeting or whatever, but the rest of the week is mine. I can do what I want with it. It's mine. It's for my comfort and ease and whatever. Jesus is not interested in that. He is interested in wholehearted, complete, total devotion every day of the week. Jesus' tax rate is 100%. He wants all of us, all that we are, all that we have, all the resources at our disposal, all our capacities, our talents, our gifts. They belong to him. And he wants us to use those for his glory. Now, it's lovely being an elder as part of this network of churches, because we hear just lovely things from the different congregations. And one of the encouraging things is that I've heard stories of members of our congregations doing exactly this in all sorts of different areas of their life. So some among our congregations have been given incredible resources, quite astonishing resources. And Jesus is calling those of us, those of you, to devote those to him. That might mean, and this will just be an impossibility for lots of us thinking this, but that might mean that you need to give away to the kingdom tens of thousands of pounds a week. And that's what some people have done. It is exactly what Jesus is calling you to. Extraordinary generosity for his kingdom. Now, you might hear that and think, okay, well, that's a complete impossibility. I don't have tens of thousands of pounds. And one of the lovely things about this section in Luke is that actually it's both ends of the spectrum. There are the people who have been given extraordinary resources and the people who have so little. And actually the example that Jesus highlights in just a few passages' time is a woman, a widow, who has basically nothing. She has 2 pennies. But the pennies that she does have, she gives them to the Lord. And Jesus marks her out as the one example through all of history of this type of total devotion. But it's not just in money and resources, it's everything. So I think of another example of a guy who has let Jesus be king and Lord and have dominion over his sexual purity. And that's really inconvenient for him, because basically what that means for him is that on his phone he doesn't have an internet browser. He doesn't have any social media apps. And if he wants to install a new app, his wife has to put in a password that he doesn't know. So his phone is just like emails and phone and messages, basically. But such is his desire that Jesus be Lord over all of his life, including that aspect of his sexual purity, that it doesn't matter when he has to have the very inconvenient, embarrassing conversation with a colleague who says, oh, can I show you this thing on YouTube? Give me your phone. And he has to say, oh, no, I don't have YouTube. And they say, oh, why not? That is an embarrassing, awkward conversation, but it doesn't matter, because he's given Jesus lordship and dominion over all of his life, or that area of his life. It's inconvenient, but that's okay, because Jesus is worth the inconvenience. Or think about relationships. Think about the people in our family of churches who have denied themselves a relationship that their family has encouraged them to have, or their non-Christian friends have encouraged them to have because they think it will make them happy, and they deny themselves of that relationship. because they want to obey the Lord, and they've let Jesus have dominion over that aspect of their life. Now, some of us might be listening in and thinking, well, that's all very well, but actually I don't have any resources. It feels like I don't have any capacities. You know, it may be that in the providence of God, God has led us into the midst of what feels like the trial. And we feel depleted of our resources and depleted of our talents. Think of a guy in our congregation at Bishopston who, because of global circumstances, has had to give up his ministry in a country and move to Bristol. He left his church, he left lots of his family, and he's found himself in Bristol, and he can't speak English very well. In that situation, what are you supposed to do? Because it feels like I've been depleted of my resources. I've nothing to offer Jesus anymore. And I think in that situation, Jesus calls us to surrender that trial to him. Jesus wants to have dominion over that trial. He wants us to give that to him. He wants us to serve him in that in such a way that he is honored and glorified as king. And it's the surrender, the total surrender of a broken person who has nothing left and says, with the psalmist, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And on earth there is nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart and my family and my mental health and my job and everything else may fail. But God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." That is total devotion, isn't it? That is what Jesus is calling us to. A life lived totally for him. And the rest of us will look on at that and see the precious value of our King. And if you're not a Christian, Jesus is calling you to surrender to him. He's calling you to live for him. He owns you. You are made in his image. And he's asking you to give yourself back to him. Let's pray. Father, whatever situation we find ourselves in, whether we have tens of thousands of pounds to give to the kingdom each week, or whether we have nothing and we feel completely depleted of our capacities of resources, Lord, I pray that you would work in our hearts so that our desire would be to render to Jesus what is his, to give it all to him. Amen.
I'm going to invite Matt to come back up. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Matt. We've got loads and loads of questions. I'm going to start. Actually, there's quite a lot of questions just based on the theme of giving everything to Jesus. And there's lots of questions about, if we were to give everything to Jesus and so therefore completely deplete what we have, and then perhaps, we then become a burden on others or society, and, is that the right sort of thing to do?
I mean, the really cheeky to answer that is come back in 2 weeks. Because okay. Presumably that's what people would have said about the widow. You've got 2 coins and you're giving them both to the Lord. What are you doing? You don't have any coins left. So that's the cheeky answer. I mean, I can think of an example of someone in our church who was in real financial need, and they told someone else, and this other person said to them, they needed like thousands of pounds, and this other person said to them, "You can have it, I'll give it to you. We've been saving up, you can have it. Pay it back if you can in 5, 10 years, doesn't matter, but we've been saving up in case someone is in need." And they weren't a rich, well-off family, they were just a family who, they could have used a holiday in Italy skiing or whatever, but they had been saving explicitly for that purpose. And so there's a sense in which, of course, if we're going to bless other people, then we need to be wise with our money. Don't be frivolous with it. We need to be wise with it. I don't know if that's our problem. I don't know. I think my problem is that I just want to be comfortable, and I don't want to give the money away. I want to use it on myself, or whatever it might be, or my time, or. But yeah, come back in 2 weeks and ask whoever's preaching then. Okay,
brilliant. Great, so watch your space. Great, and there's loads of comments saying, great talk, thank you so much. So someone says, give back to God what is God and give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. What does it look like on a daily basis in small ways to give back to God, just in those, everyday things?
Yeah, I think that's where it really, that's where the rubber really hits the road, because actually you need £5,000, let me give you £5,000. That situation doesn't happen very much. What happens is, the day-to-day decisions of, okay, this is a really frustrating situation with my colleague, my wife, my kid, whatever. Am I going to let Jesus be Lord over this, or am I just going to let my own sinful desires rule me? So yeah, I think that's where it really, really matters. And yeah, it's total and complete, isn't it, what he's asking of us? That would be a great thing to talk about in small groups. In my individual situation, what does this mean for me with my difficult work relationship?
Yeah, brilliant. And just finally, just one last question. So what do you do if your heart's pulling away from this truth, or you actually don't want to be owned, other than perhaps in prayer?
Yeah. Again, that would be a great thing. Get a coffee with someone. If that's you and you're feeling, I don't want to do this. I don't want to give everything to Jesus. That would be a great thing to share with someone and pray through and talk about. Obviously, there's a balance in Scripture of both the call to surrender totally to the Lord, and also the reality of living in a broken, fallen world with difficult relationships and a heart that is tempted. And it's both of those things. Both of those things are true, isn't it? So if the temptation is, I want to do something else, and I want to give myself to something else, and in some senses that's completely normal, because that's what the Christian experience is. It's putting sin to death. That's a pretty active sort of verb, isn't it? There is an expectation that we will have to do something about our sin. So yeah, it's both of those things together, I think. It's not, Jesus doesn't say that this will be easy, but he says this is what we're called to.
Brilliant, great. Well, thank you so much, Matt. That's great. And as Matt said, if you've got any other questions,